Tonight, we won't unroll maps to count caravan routes or recite the names of forgotten dynasties. Instead, we'll step into a desert so vast it doesn't just surround you, it absorbs you. Here, silence isn't an absence. It's a substance heavier than stone, stretching from dune to dune like an invisible ocean. The Sahara has never been in a hurry. It keeps its own calendar, measured not in months or years, but in the patient drift of sand over walls, wells, and doorways. Some say the desert isn't empty at all. It's a library with the covers closed, waiting for wind to turn the page. Out here, the night sky presses low, stars bright enough to feel like companions, and the wind carves the horizon into something that feels both eternal and shifting at once. Every step carries the memory of those who walked before merchants with salt, pilgrims with prayers, soldiers with ambitions that melted into dust. So lower the lights. Let the weight of the desert settle over you like a second blanket. And if your breath begins to match the slow rhythm of the dunes rising, pausing, falling, that's just the Sahara teaching you its pace. If quiet journeys like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share the time and place you're listening from, perhaps the next desert fire will be waiting for you there. And when the fire's last ember folds into ash, the desert does what it always does, pretends nothing was ever there. The wind smooths over the footprints, the stars withdraw their light, and morning begins as if the night were only a dream. That is where we'll start, with the first small sounds of a camp returning to life. The Sahara is a patient archivist. It files cities away under drifts of sand, misplaces roads for centuries at a time, and then, just when someone is sure there was never anything here at all, it reveals a doorway, a pot rim, or a low wall that looks suspiciously straight. For now, tuck in. We will move slowly like a camel that has opinions about every pebble, and listen to the desert's quiet habit of swallowing history as if it were a bedtime snack. Legends, of course, got here first. Travelers spoke of a pale city called Sahara, with doors sealed by birds and keys shaped like ostrich feathers, which is exactly the kind of detail that makes a legend sound official at 3 a.m. Medieval geographers wrote about towns that woke up one windstorm later, missing a gate or an outer street. Whole markets went silent after a camps in one of those dusty spring. Winds rearranged the neighborhood like a fussy librarian. The stories agree on the pace. Not a cinematic collapse, no roaring catastrophe, just edges softened. Courtyards silted, wells filled grain by grain. If you visit an old Sahara today, one of those walled mud brick towns along a caravan stop, you might see a lintel that ends in a dune instead of a wall, or a staircase that politely declines to reach the ground. Desert ruins often look incomplete on purpose, like sentences that end in ellipses. Somewhere behind the sand, the rest of the sentence waits, unbothered. Because the Sahara prefers footnotes to headlines, its roots were always thinner than its rumors. The famous roads, Timbuktu to Alada, Ghadames to Kano, Tripoli to Lake Chad, were not so much lines as chains of little compromises. Each link was a well, or a rock that threw a sliver of shade at noon, or a friendly acacia whose thorns knew not to puncture a water skin. Caravans measured distance not by miles, but by how many bowls of posca that sour water and vinegar drink remained agreeable, and by the number of times a bell's leather thong needed mending. The road could break if a single well failed, if a date harvest faltered, if a clan disagreed about tolls at a narrow pass. The phrase vanished overnight simply meant the desert reminded everyone that a map is a suggestion. The next season, the path would nudge south to a fresh well or north to a more patient official, and last year's footprints would be retired. Scholars draw these movements with dotted lines. Camels preferred a dotted line anyway. It promised freedom to step around prickly plants and unhelpful bureaucracy. There were cities here, absolutely. Some were large enough to borrow a horizon. Others were modest, a cellar with jars for grain, a courtyard where goat hooves polish the floor. Sand has no respect for building permits, and the result is a pleasing variety. In the Fazan, the Garamantes built in brick the color of autumn bread, and the alleys were surprisingly narrow, as if tall walls could corral a breeze and persuade it to behave like a street fan. In the Western Desert, manuscript towns wrapped their libraries in salt trade wealth, and in the eastern margins there were stone circles that made a careful nuisance of themselves by aligning with stars. The desert does not brag about any of this. It simply adds a little more sand to the corners and hums. When people say evidence, they often mean something you can screenshot. The Sahara, obligingly, offers images, just not the kind you notice while scrolling too quickly. Spy satellites built to spy on other things accidentally became careful historians. Their old black and white film shows bright threads running across what looks like a blank sheet. Those threads are dry rivers, paleocanals, slipping east to west like ghost handwriting. Radar, with a temperament that appreciates subtlety, reaches beneath the surface and sketches the outline of a vanished lake here, a braided delta there. Lake Megachad, which sounds like a cartoon superhero, but was in fact an inland sea big enough to impress an inland sea, shrank and walked away from its old shoreline, leaving fish fossils with nothing to do. Down toward the Atlantic, a truly enormous buried river, the Tamanrasset, appears like a long, polite underline drawn under the desert. You can trace it with a fingertip on a screen at 2 a.m. and feel mildly accomplished without moving at all. Zoom in a little, and the images go from grand to domestic. You see faint squares, stubborn rectangles, and dots arranged in lines like beads that forgot the string. The squares often betray houses. The lines of dots sometimes lead to graves. The rectangles are walls that decided to continue existing even after the roofs negotiated an exit. On the fringes of the Nile and in Sudanese sands, small steep pyramids, far cousins of the broad Egyptian sort, sit with the patience of late arriving guests. Many are half buried, as if the desert tucked them in against a chill that never arrives. In Libya's Fazan, the Garamantes coaxed water through underground galleries, called Fogra's horizontal wells that persuade the water table to cooperate without being dramatic. If you walk above them, you see a rash of ventilation shafts, each a small circle of stones like a mouth making the letter O. Archaeology in the Sahara is often the art of noticing repeated O's and thinking, yes, that must lead somewhere practical. Occasionally, a satellite image reveals something that looks like ambition. A cluster of tumuli traces an arc with suspicious neatness. A long wall runs straight, even where nothing else does. Straight is a rare luxury in a sea of curves, and you begin to wonder who have the time and the rope to keep it so honest. Desert kites, those wide V-shaped stone arrangements used to funnel game, appear in Arabia much more famously, but the Sahara answers with its own enigmas. Field systems scratched into gravel plains, stone corrals now courting only wind, and road marks where wheels once preferred to be. None of it shouts. It whispers, which suits bedtime very well. Theories are a way of staying awake politely. One of the gentlest is the climate theory. After the last ice age, the Sahara went green in a long, patient yawn called the African humid period. Monsoon rains reached north, and lakes sprawled under a sky that believed in them. People camped beside hippos and sketched giraffes on fresh rock faces. There is a famous swimmer in a cave who has been gliding nowhere for thousands of years, arms too relaxed to finish the pool length. Then, over millennia, and the desert is proud of its millennia, the rains retreated. Grasses sulked and faded, lake edges crisped. Wells deepened one rope length at a time. You can imagine a city that thrived on year-round herds deciding to become a village, then a seasonal camp, then a cautionary story about storing more water jars. The old caravan road checked its wells and politely took its business elsewhere. No villain required. just the world doing what it does when tilts and currents rearrange their meetings. The climate explanation has a wonderfully sleepy rhythm. It involves orbital cycles with names that sound like minor characters in a 19th century novel. Milankovitch and friends who drop by with small talk about eccentricity and precession. It involves dust cores from the Atlantic that remember which way the wind preferred to carry old pollen. It involves lake shorelines that step down like stairs you can't see until evening light draws them out. If you are still listening, congratulate yourself quietly. You are now an expert in very slow change. It is exactly the kind that ruins a city's day without ever raising its voice. Of course, there are livelier proposals that wave from the edges of scholarship like enthusiastic cousins at a family reunion. The round, layered Richet structure, sometimes called the Eye of the Sahara, sits in Mauritania and photographs beautifully, which is how theories often begin a conversation. Its circles, all geology is doing, have tempted people into assigning it to Atlantis duty. Geologists, with the weary affection of professionals who have answered the same question at many birthday parties, explain that the Richet is a deeply eroded dome of rock, more onion than empire, the rings carved by time and respectably unmythical. As bedtime metaphors go, it is agreeable. The desert looking back at you, unblinking, while you attach stories to a gaze that does not especially require them. Other myths visit for tea. Herodotus mentioned curious things about Libyan peoples who chased cave dwellers and drove chariots on hard salt flats. Medieval writers folded those tidbits into later tales about white cities, black caravans, and golden bucks. A good rule, while you are yawning, is to enjoy the adjectives and keep a little jar for the nouns you can dig. Adjectives tend to blow away. Still, myths serve a purpose. They keep curiosity slightly ajar, like a door wedged with a smooth pebble, which is excellent ventilation for the mind at night. If the desert retains its secrets, it is not only because the sand is loyal. Practical matters intervene, all very boring in the best way. Excavations need permits that travel at camel speed. A trench dug today may be a gentle dune tomorrow, and field notes acquire a respectable collection of the word probably. The nearest cold storage for artifacts might be several mornings' drive away, and that drive may include a discussion with the tire about whether it intends to remain round. Political borders do what borders do. Funding prefers sites that advertise themselves more loudly. The result is a literature of careful phrases, surface scatter, possible occupation, enigmatic feature. These are lullaby words. They promise that no one will shout Eureka while you are trying to sleep. There is also the matter of fragility. Manuscripts in desert towns, thin pages of ink and prayer dislike handling humidity, and the sudden attentiveness of people who did not check their hands for dust. Mud brick walls are stoic but not immortal. If you lean too hard, you may meet the past more intimately than you planned. Water tunnels collapse if scolded. Even footprints may be older than your plans. Archaeologists learn to walk with a softness that would impress a librarian. They tie their hats with string. They label bags of sand with a date and a grid number because, frankly, most of what you excavate in a dune looks exactly like the thing you excavated 1 minute ago, and the label is the only way to tell you have indeed changed the world at all. Meanwhile, the desert continues its patient work. Birchen dunes migrate at a pace you could measure with a tape if you were very persistent and fond of disappointment. Gravel plains regs hold their surfaces like a polite smile, hardly different today than they were when a Roman merchant dropped a broken amphora and made a note to buy a better one next time. An erg, which is a proper sea of dunes rather than a mere suggestion, will shift like a sleeping animal adjusting its shoulder. Oases hum to themselves, making dates with their palm trees. The sky hosts a thin blue rehearsal for eternity. If this is not excitement, it is at least reliable company. Every so often, a quiet discovery rewards the quiet methods. A radar line becomes a trench, becomes a wall, becomes a room where someone stored grinding stones and a little lamp. A chain of tumuli leads to a burial with beads that once told someone a story in a color code we only partly understand. A Fogara, cleared of collapsed sections, breathes again, just a little sigh, and the oasis behaves as if nothing surprising has happened. Even the pyramids in Sudan, the small ones with sharp angles, accept a brush and a camera without commentary, like cats indulgently tolerating guests. The world does not announce itself, but it does allow footnotes. You may wonder why we still don't know the full truth. Part of it is simply that full truth is a city with no road. We work from shards and shadows. In the Sahara, field seasons are timed like careful naps. Short, planned, easily disturbed. Data piles up not as breakthroughs, but as drawers labeled later. And yet, modestly, the drawers begin to explain where the rivers went, why a town turned its back to the wind, how a trade network could depend on salt so completely that blocks of it were money with edges. Salt has the satisfying virtue of being stackable. A caravan arranged it into neat walls and called it wealth, which is not far from how any of us feel about clean folded laundry. There is also patience involved, the kind the desert teaches. A scholar may spend a year arguing about whether a low semicircle of stones is a hut base or a hearth windbreak, and both may be correct on alternating Tuesdays. A satellite analyst shades a rectangle in a dataset that looks exactly like every other rectangle, and yet this one is different enough to justify more tea. A local guide points to a mound that used to be a door, and if you tilt your head the right way, you can see the threshold. It helps if you bring your own shade and a friendly willingness to believe in thresholds. So the mystery remains, but it is a friendly kind. The Sahara is not plotting anything. It is merely large, and time behaves strangely when measured in dunes. Somewhere under the sand, a city wall naps with its stones surprisingly aligned. A workshop keeps. A cache of broken beads that failed the final knot in a road polite as ever waits for a season when the wells agree to participate. We have maps that are mostly suggestions, legends that are mostly adjectives, and evidence that is mostly rectangles. It is enough. Let the satellites hum quietly overhead. Let the wind smooth another corner. We can return tomorrow, and the desert will still be here, patient as a book left open on a table, pages hardly moving, story unworried about who finishes it first. You might not expect a desert to be a meticulous archivist, but the Sahara files its paperwork with sand. It stamps whole towns with the grainy seal of forgetfulness, stacks roads in neat, windblown folders, and then, on a quiet morning, misplaces an entire city behind a dune, the way you might misplace a receipt under a couch cushion. If you're still awake by the time we get to the radar wavelengths, feel free to subscribe, or don't. The dunes won't tell on you, and I never ask them questions after dusk. For now, settle in. We'll walk at camel speed, which is the pace of a creature that has seen every pebble twice and refuses to be surprised a third time. Long before satellites and field notes and the noble institution of the carefully labeled plastic bag, the desert whispered about swallowed cities. Travelers carried these stories the way date syrup carries sweetness, slowly and with a tendency to stick to everything nearby. There was the white city of Zerzura, where the doors were said to be sealed with birds and the keys shaped like ostrich feathers, which is exactly the kind of detail that makes a legend sound unreasonably official at 3 a.m. There were markets that fell silent after a camps in the spring wind that smells like warm dust and sudden. Decisions poured a street's worth of sand into a gate that no one could be bothered to shovel until after the millet harvest. Bedouin guides described walls that ended in dunes instead of corners, stairways that stepped gently into drifts, and wells that convinced themselves they were amphorae and filled up from the wrong direction. The oddest thing is the tempo. Nothing crashes. The buildings are not defeated. They are simply tucked in. The city looks like it fell asleep while reading its own ledger and never got to the part where the taxes were totaled. Somewhere behind the dune, the rest of the sentence continues, perfectly calm, just out of breath. These whispers point to roads because cities do not vanish alone. In the Sahara, a road is not so much a line as a string of promises. Each promise is a well with a name, a flat stone that throws shade at noon, a thorny acacia that everyone agrees not to graze to death, or a rock with a nick that says, "Turn east now." Caravans counted distance in sips, not in miles. A guide judged the day by the sound a water skin made when it was pressed. An experienced hand could tell you the number of ladles left by listening, the way a baker can tell you whether dough is ready by poking it and listening for the sigh. When a well soured or a clan began to charge tolls with a little too much enthusiasm, the route would politely move one valley over. The phrase vanished overnight simply meant the footsteps elected to be somewhere else tomorrow. The old road remained, but it had retired. It had no need of visitors, and Sand promised to keep its forwarding address confidential. If you slow down, you can still see the companies these roads kept. Along the Sal's fringe, ruined Sour, those walled mud-brick towns that solved the desert's daily quiz of shade, water, and patience sit like punctuation marks on a line that only the wind remembers. Their alleys are narrow because breezes must be coaxed, and their corners are rounded because corners that jab at wind do not last. In the Fazan, the Garamantis once filled their granaries with millet that traveled carefully through underground channels. In the air and the Adrar, small strongholds of stone watch a gravel plain that refuses to change its expression from one century to the next. Farther east, in Nubia and the Bayuda, pyramids with steep shoulders hold their ground in tidy ranks. Some wear sand like a shawl pulled on against a chill that never arrives. The horizon looks oddly curated, as if time hired a thoughtful librarian. Evidence nowadays prefers pixels. The earliest were captured with film that had other assignments, and so some of the Sahara's best archaeological photographs were taken by satellites that were supposed to be minding entirely different business. Long, faint threads cross the hard pan. Dry riverbeds, paleocanals scribbling from south to north, north to south, and, in a few ambitious stretches, toward a vanished shoreline that still remembers how to be a shoreline at sunset. Synthetic aperture radar, which appreciates subtlety and is remarkably unbothered by sand, draws ghost rivers on the screen like underlines in a forgotten book. You can follow the buried Tamanrasat system from the Hagar toward the Atlantic, a river you could once have sailed in your imagination, provided your boat had opinions about dunes. To the southeast lies the memory of Lake Megachad, whose modern remnant does its best, but looks like a teacup placed politely on the saucer where a punch bowl used to be. Dust cores from the ocean nearby keep an inventory of what the wind carried. They are fussy accountants who never forget a seed. Zoom further, and the romantic turns domestic. Pixels arrange themselves into rectangles that were once rooms, dots that were once post holes, lines that were once fences built by someone who believed straightness to be a moral virtue. In Libya's Fezon, strings of round mouths ventilation shafts mark fogaras, those horizontal wells that coax water to flow without melodrama. Stand above them and the ground looks as if it practices the letter O in stone. An old photograph catches a line of dots crossing a wadi, each dot a shaft, each shaft attached to a tunnel, each tunnel attached to a field that never asked to be famous. If you are still awake, congratulations, you have become the kind of person who can be charmed by a V-shaped scatter of low stones, the so-called desert kites that once funneled game toward a cheerful misunderstanding. Pyramids prefer not to brag, but the Nubian ones will tolerate a visitor who arrives with respectful slowness. They are smaller than their Egyptian cousins and steeper, like a child's careful drawing performed with a ruler and optimism. Some are half buried up to the waist, which gives them an unexpectedly cozy look, as if the desert prepared a seat cushion. In a few oases, archaeologists whisper about stairways that descend beneath the houses, galleries that ferried water in the dark, and tunnels that remind everyone how far a community will go to avoid the sun. The Garamantis engineered entire suburbs with shade in mind, their fogras bringing groundwater to fields like waiters who never spill a drop. If you walk the fields at dawn, you can still see the layout and the date palms discipline, as though agriculture has a memory even after the farmers are a rumor. Then come the theories, the bedtime stories with charts. The simplest wears a patient face and is called climate. After the last ice age, the Sahara was green in the long way of green lakes lounging in basins, grasses rehearsing waves, hippos making bureaucratic noises in the shallows. Monsoon rains wandered farther north than they do now. The sky reached out and signed seasonal agreements with places that today know only starlight and occasional discussion. People lived beside water and drew what they saw. Elegant giraffes with hooves like commas, herds standing in the kind of shade that makes a person consider poetry, and swimmers in caves gliding nowhere at all. Millennia passed. The rain lines redrafted themselves in language only the ocean fully condones. Lakes shrugged into puddles, then into salt flats with a taste for mirage. Wells deepened rope by rope until there were no more ropes. Towns discovered that walls, excellent against thieves, are unpersuasive against climate. Nothing exploded. It was simply Tuesday for 1,000 years in a row. Climate has supporting evidence with the satisfying dryness of a ledger. Pollen grains, trapped in mud, announced that grasses once auditioned for the part of forest. Shorelines step down around old lakes like thoughtful staircases. Dune fields advance and then rest, so slowly you could knit between their movements. Even the wind remembers. The orientation of certain dunes preserves a season that is no longer scheduled. The argument does not show. It taps the page with a pencil and asks you, gently, to consider how a road departs a town when the well decides it would prefer to be history. If you have ever watched a supermarket quietly change the aisle where the tea is kept, you already understand logistics on the scale of Immerse. Not everyone is satisfied with patient pencils. Some theories arrive at the meeting with enthusiasm and a slideshow. The Eye of the Sahara, the Richet structure photographs, so handsomely that people assign it to Atlantis the way an aunt assigns cousins to careers at holiday dinners. Its concentric circles look like myth drawn with a compass. Geologists, bless them, show up with hammers and a shrug, explaining that the Richet is an eroded dome, an onion of rocks peeled by time, rings shaped by water, wind, and a refusal to be romantic. It is spectacular and uninterested in being Plato. If you need Atlantis, the desert will not argue. It will simply continue to be geology while you nap. Other myths knock politely. Herodotus mentions Libyan peoples who drove chariots on salt flats, which is the sort of image that keeps a historian entertained on a long bus ride. There are tales of white cities, black caravans, and libraries bound in the color of a well-fed date. Medieval authors wrote them down with adjectives that smell like cinnamon. A reasonable approach is to keep the nouns city, caravan, library, and let the cinnamon blow away. Still, there is hospitality in a myth. It reserves you a seat at the table of curiosity and does not mind if you only pick at the olives. Why, given all these photographs and patient arguments, do we still not know the full truth? The desert keeps secrets, yes, but the larger issue is paperwork. Excavation requires permits that move at the speed of a thoughtful camel. Field seasons are short, the weather is warm. Tires prefer to express themselves in the middle of nowhere. A trench dug this morning may be partially edited by wind by dinner time, and the wind does not sign your forms. Funding, which is allergic to words like enigmatic scatter, often asks whether a site can sell tickets, which is not a question that a line of post holes can answer without help from a brochure. Even satellites are coy. A rectangle may be a rune, or a rectangle may be a trick of shadow, or a rectangle may be the ghost of a field where goats once practiced geometry. Fragility helps keep the silence. Manuscripts in Saharan towns dislike humidity, bright light, and people who turn pages as if they were negotiating a treaty. Mud brick walls will forgive a gentle lean, but not twice. Foie gras collapse if scolded. Pottery sherds look precisely like pottery sherds no matter how important they are, so you must label the bag, and then label the label, and then promise yourself you will remember which trench was the northern one when the wind decides. Kindly to turn the world into a softly rattling curtain. Archaeologists learn to walk like librarians. They tie their hats with string. They write probably more times in a season than most people do in a decade, and then they dream of grids. So the Sahara remains a considerate mystery, the sort you can sleep beside without feeling the need to solve. Somewhere beneath a dune, a stairway waits, each step worn in the middle where the sandals learn to pass. A buried wall keeps its straightness with the dignity of a quiet line. A road rests, knowing that a route is nothing more than an agreement between a well and a traveler, and agreements can be renewed in any century. Satellites trace the ghost of a river and hum to themselves. Radar returns with a whisper in the X-band, which sounds like a jazz station but is mostly sand having an opinion about wavelength. Scholars file another modest report under possible, a word that belongs in bedtime stories more than most. If you lie very still, you can imagine the caravan at night. The camels sit, long-necked question marks folding into answers. The bell thongs creak as if thinking of repairs. Someone warms water that tastes faintly of yesterday's tea and calls it new tea, which is technically correct. In the distance, a low hill pretends to be a fortress, and the fortress pretends to be a low hill. A guide names the wells again out loud, each with the familiar emphasis that comes from friendship. The blue one, the bitter one, the generous one, the one that always has a frog. The road is a rumor among stars. Cities sleep beneath sand like notebooks under a pillow. In the morning, nothing urgent will happen. A breeze will take an interest in your footprints and arrange them in a more pleasing order. A fly will prefer the map to your face, which is considerate. If you walk to the edge of camp, the ground will look freshly ironed. The old river will keep its underline faint and moil. You could spend another day tracing rectangles and decide correctly that rectangles are restful. The pyramids will continue to be steep and small, uncertain of themselves. The foie gras shafts will continue to make the letter O the desert, like a librarian who has already found the book you need and is just letting you finish your sentence will wait. We do not know the full story, and the pleasing part is that we do not need to tonight. The Sahara is an excellent host for unanswered questions. It offers you a dune to lean against, a sky with nothing but stars, and a moon that minds its own business. And the knowledge that somewhere just underfoot, a city is being perfectly quiet. Tomorrow someone will notice a new pattern in a satellite image, draw a rectangle, and add the polite word feature. A year later, a trench will find a wall. 10 years later, the wall will have a room, and the room a grinding stone, and the grinding stone a little cache of seeds that failed to be bred. This is how mysteries grow friendlier, not smaller. So let the world go on, not knowing. Let the wind keep its promises. Let the maps be dotted, the wells be named, and the roads adjust themselves as they please. If you listen closely, the desert is telling you the same bedtime story it told merchants and monks and messengers with sore feet. That time moves in a slow circle here, and the circle is rather content. You might not expect a desert to be a gentle companion, but it is. It has all the patience in the world and a very tidy filing system, and somewhere in its drawers a place where your thoughts can fold up like tents and rest without having to explain themselves to anyone at all. You might not expect a rumor to leave footprints, but in the Sahara, the softest stories walk across entire horizons. A guide will point to a seam in the sand and say very gently that a doorway used to be there, and that if the wind is in a listening mood, you can sometimes hear the hinges remembering their work. If you are still awake by the time we get to the satellite wavelengths, you're welcome to subscribe or yawn, and let the dunes handle it for you. They take messages well. For now, we move slowly, with the kind of patience a camel uses when it decides to chew something for the historical record. The legends have a household tone, like family recipes for invisible towns. People talk about cities swallowed by sand the way others talk about cellars full of preserves. Zerzura appears often, a white city tucked into an oasis that is always a little farther than you thought. Its gates painted with birds, its keys described with an amount of confidence that suggests no one actually held one. A caravan driver will tell you that the market there sold salt bricks, the size of bread loaves, though there is some debate over whether customers were expected to slice them with a knife or with a politely sharpened breeze. There are stories of staircases descending into dunes as if the sand had agreed to become carpeting, and of wells that developed this strange habit of filling themselves from above after a particularly enthusiastic Khamsin wind. None of this is offered with urgency. In the desert, astonishment is conducted at a hush. A ruin is simply a building that decided to nap. Between these sleepy cities ran routes that did their best work by being obvious and then, quite suddenly, by being shy. Traders strung the Sahara with predictable beads of water, a well that tasted faintly of iron, and good luck, a stand of acacia trees that gave just enough shade at noon to make palm dates feel. Appreciated a flat boulder that served as both landmark and very moderate throne. The phrase ancient trade routes that vanished overnight was never about drama. It described a practical vote. If a well went bitter or a clan raised the toll on passing goats with a flourish, no one admired the caravan shifted one valley to the west, and the map followed quietly, changing the definition of overnight to mean after tea. What was left behind was not abandoned so much as retired. A road in the Sahara can stop working and still sit there with perfect dignity. The way an old ledger looks useful even after the numbers have forgotten what they were counting. The towns along these lines were built by people who knew that walls should be rounded when they speak to wind. In Sahara of the Maghreb, the alleys bend like elbows, leading air along at a polite walking pace. In the Fazan, the Garamontes, who are as fond of water as any desert people could be, taught groundwater to go where they wanted by digging long, low tunnels that preferred the dark. Fagres, they called them, and the ground above them is dotted with little round mouths of maintenance shafts, a string of O's recording the sound the earth makes when it is pleased. Elsewhere, the walls stand as tidy as folded blankets. Stone guard posts face a sea of gravel that refuses, quite stubbornly, to grow interesting for miles and miles. When wind starts arranging your neighborhood, it is helpful to be on good terms with corners, shade, and patience. Evidence has its own pace, and right now it enjoys orbit. Satellites notice things that were not courting attention. On one screen, long faint threads cross the hardpan paleocanals, ancient riverbeds as shy as erased pencil lines. On another, radar remembers how to look through sand and returns with the outline of a river big, enough to make a map blush. The Tamanrasset system, now buried, once running like a quiet spine from the Hagar Mountains toward the Atlantic. The ocean incidentally keeps the receipts. Dust blown off the Sahara lands in its sediments and forms layers that can be read, the way you might read the rings of a tree if the tree had a very dry sense of humor. South and east, you can trace the ghost shoreline of a lake that used to be called Megachat because no one could agree on a settler name large enough. In the present, it is a polite puddle with grand memories. Zoom far enough and the pixels get domestic. Little rectangles of slightly darker ground reveal compounds and courtyards. Dots mark post holes. Lines declare fences set with a ruler and optimism. High-resolution images display the soft geometry of desert kites, vast V-shaped arrays of low stones that once guided herds into narrow ends. There are tales of scatter that look exactly like pottery sherds because they are pottery sherds. And there are fields whose furrows still shows, as if the plowman only stopped to drink and then lost track of the century. Some patterns look like cities indulging in the habit of keeping grid paper under their clothes. Even the pyramids here have a quiet profile. In Nubia, the ones at Meru and Nuri stand steep and small, as if someone had built them with a set square and a calm breath. Many are half nestled in sand, which lends them the contented appearance of late afternoon tea drinkers. They belong to kingdoms that exchanged letters with pharaohs and kept their own versions of royal worries. A few have stairways that slip underground to chapels and chambers and in the oasis towns. Farther west, the tunnels that fed fields can still be followed as they descend into dark. Cool air like hallways designed for the comfort of water. Archaeologists approach these places with a librarian's gait, careful, hat tied down, pockets full of labels for the labels, and the enduring hope that a wall will continue to be a wall while their backs are turned. At some point, theories must be invited in, and they arrive with charts that smell faintly of dust and coffee. The calmest of them suggests that early empires here were not so much defeated as slowly outvoted by climate. After the last ice age, northern Africa hosted an African humid period. A phrase that sounds like a weather clerk's holiday, but once meant lakes that glittered where dunes now rehearse their poses, rivers that braided themselves between hills, and grasslands that gave giraffes the courage to draw their reflections on rock. People lived beside water, and, being humans, they drew themselves swimming in caves, which is a detail so charming that it occasionally keeps researchers awake, even when they intend to nap. Over millennia, the monsoons drifted south, as if the sky had changed its mailing address. Rains grew stingy. Lakes took the hint and folded themselves into salt flats. Riverbeds made their peace with silence. Wells grew deeper until ropes had opinions about it. Towns recited the math of distance and decided that a different oasis, 1-2 days farther, looked promising in the abstract. There was no collapse in the melodramatic sense. There was a long, protracted shrug. You might not expect a pile of sand to keep a guest book, but the Sahara has a habit of remembering who visited and when. And handwriting so neat, it looks like wind did calligraphy. If you re still awake when I wander into the question of ancient drainage basins and the extremely patient manners of fossil rivers, feel free to subscribe in whatever way people subscribe to a whisper, or just do nothing and let the dunes sign your name for you. They're considerate like that. For now, pull the night around your shoulders the way traders once pulled cloaks around their shoulders, and listen to the old rumor that cities can learn to nap. The earliest stories are told at the edge of a fire that has the good sense to burn slow. A caravan sits ropes coiled like sleepy snakes, and someone mentions a place they passed without passing. A walled town, no taller than the wind sunk to its eyebrows' doors, outlined in a crisp fringe of ripple marks, as if the sand ironed them. They say the market bears sold salt the way modern shops sell batteries every size wrapped in cloth that crackled, and that the baker was famous for her bread. You could slice with a piece of pottery and eat with your feelings. There is a name that returns again and again, Zuzura, the white city, not white like paint, but white like a new page. It sits in memory by a pool too clean to be real, shaded by palms that know just how much to move, and it hires gatekeepers who never raise their voices. People report arriving and not arriving, and buying dates with a coin they cannot later find. This is, admittedly, not the sort of evidence a museum prefers. It is the sort that a tired person does. Busand is fine with it. These whispers turn into lines on the ground because even a rumor needs a road. The trade routes across the desert felt their way from well to well, the way your feet feel their way from cool tile to carpet in the dark. Some paths kept to the flanks of the Hamada, those stubborn stone plateaus that refused to do drama. Others traced the seams left by rivers that had stopped being rivers but still enjoyed the reputation. Camels learned the distances by heart. People learned where the wind liked to show its teeth. At certain outcrops, you could count past caravans by reading the graffiti, names, dates, ships carved with persuasive optimism so far inland that the sandstone blushed. The phrase "routes that vanished overnight" was never a panic. It described a logistical shrug. A single well turns brackish, or a local tax acquires an extra syllable, and the next week the line is a valley over, leaving behind a perfectly good road that has suddenly become a memory with an address. A traveler will return years later and find the ground exactly where it was, and the path politely not there. The cities that lived on these lines made architecture with rounded corners and low voices. In certain oases, the streets narrow, crook, and duck, bending like elbows to usher the wind along without letting it get ideas. Roofs borrow shade from one another. Doors are carved with small, stubborn geometry. If you put your ear to a wall at noon, it will tell you where the shadow used to be in early spring. The builders were not romantic about sand. They treated it as a neighbor, the kind you wave to from the doorstep, and also teach not to come inside unless invited. When the climate began to prefer dryness, some towns grew quiet without any catastrophe at all. Residents packed their bread molds, watered their last seedlings, and left a neat note for the wind. The desert does not punish such behavior, it slowly files it. Evidence, however, prefers numbers and a good vantage. Orbiting instruments peer down and notice textures we do not. Radar, which is basically the desert version of polite X-ray vision, sends a wave through the dunes and receives a reply from an old river the size of a country. The Tamanrasset system, the map says, as if a bureaucrat had finally found the right drawer. It once braided through what is now polite emptiness, carrying silt, gossip, and fish. On screen it is all lines as faint as veins in a leaf. Elsewhere satellites catch the quiet discipline of ancient fields rectangles drawn on land that no one has argued with for 1,000 years, and see the long low V's of desert kites, those stone arrays that guided herds into narrower conclusions. Zoom closer and you find circles marching across gravel like a dotted sentence, the maintenance shafts of underground channels. Fagras and Canets, water's preferred rooms. They are as practical as a well-folded blanket. And because the Sahara is in a generous mood, it offers pyramids too, though not the pyramids you are used to. In Nubia, around Meru and Nuri, they rise in steep little rinds of stone, closer to a child's drawing of a pyramid than to Giza's massive certainty. Many are partly clothed in sand, which gives them the contented look of someone who has found exactly the right chair. Tomb chapels sink below ground in ramps and stairs, painted once, now quiet. Farther west, the underground tunnels of the Fazan run for kilometers, measured by buckets, kept alive by maintenance shafts the size of agreeable conversation. Go down one, and you understand immediately that water likes corridors. An archaeologist descends with a soft brush and the kind of pencil that makes neat, tiny letters, and returns dusty and grateful for shade, and this is considered progress. After the pictures come the charts, which hum a little to themselves, the way charts do when they are pleased. Theories assemble. The calmest of them says that much of the Sahara, around 10,000 years ago, was briefly in a good mood. The African humid period, a name that sounds like bad hair and is actually lakes. Rivers and patient hippos took up residence. People drew swimmers on cave walls because they were, in fact, swimming. They herded cattle across savannas so grassy that the rocks developed a green memory. Then, slowly, in that way, the planet likes because it's easier on the paperwork. The monsoon chose a different address. Rain became a visitor rather than a tenant. Lakes left forwarding notes in the form of shorelines etched into hills. Dunes found work. Wells deepened until ropes had opinions. You can measure the change in dust layers in ocean cores. The Atlantic keeps a file cabinet. Pollen trapped in sediment says, in a voice fit for a library, that plants which prefer not to be desert had to find other hobbies. Empires, the theory concludes, ran on water. And when the meetings were rescheduled, the department simply closed their ledgers and went home. There are other ideas, as there should be. Some people suggest that human choices about herds and fire and timber nudged grasslands toward reluctant openness, that 1,000 small decisions can make a climate sigh. Others examine the timing of volcanic eruptions and solar variations with a precision that would make a watchmaker feel seen. All of these discussions proceed at a pace appropriate for a map. When the evidence is uncertain, archaeologists do not raise their voices, they sharpen their pencils. On a good day, they locate a hearth under 2 meters of calm sand and find a charred seed that agrees to be dated. On a very good day, the wind does not move the tent. The part about Atlantis arrives as gently as a camel's footfall. Someone always brings it up because circular things are tempting, and Mauritania has gifted the world the rigid structure, a set of concentric rings carved by time and enthusiasm into the Adrar Plateau. From the air, it resembles a target. On the ground, it resembles geology clearing its throat. The circles are not city walls. They are layers of resistant rock eroded with patience. This explanation, which is correct, is also slightly sleepy, which suits our purpose. Plato's island remains in its own story miles of ocean away. The Sahara keeps its own myths, Zerzura, buried staircases, a caravan that walks into a sandstorm and back out the other side half a day older and oddly sure that the landscape changed its mind. Myths are not evidence, but they are good at keeping chairs warm while evidence parks the truck. If you look for writing, you find it, though rarely where you expect. Rock faces hold petroglyphs of cattle with horns drawn large enough to have philosophical opinions. Travelers carved messages in tidy Libico-Berber scripts, tidy Tifinagh characters, quick arabesques of Arabic, and the occasional domesticated Latin letter left by a soldier who took pride in spelling his name exactly once in stone. Far to the southwest, the libraries of Timbuktu sat with their cool rooms and patient scribes, copying texts that discuss law and math and the price of salt with equal seriousness, while gritty wind politely attempted to add marginalia. These manuscripts are a different sort of archaeology, the kind that prefers linen gloves and the smell of leather to trowels and the smell of hopeful soil. Together, they suggest a network of towns and scholars and merchants who thought it completely normal to balance a bale of books on a camel. Why don't we know more if the desert is so calm and the satellites so keen? The reasons are ordinary, which is always the most convincing category. Excavation seasons are short because hot months in the Sahara are good practice for the concept of oven. Logistics enjoy being inconvenient. A broken axle in the middle of a gravel plain inspires the kind of philosophical reflections that make for long, careful memoirs. Paperwork likes stamps in exactly the right order. Funding comes in the same way rain does here, encouraging in some years, nostalgic in others. Preservation complicates things. A mud brick wall, when exposed, develops opinions about sunlight. Plaster, once freed from the earth, discovers it had secretly been held together by the pressure of dirt and sighs itself into dust if you look too proud. Even telling people where a fragile site is can be risky. Attention is not always the friend of places that do their best work by being left alone. There's also the desert's own schedule to consider. Wind moves evidence with the same politeness it moves everything else. A feature mapped on Tuesday may spend Wednesday reconsidering its position. Dunes advance with the patience of a librarian walking down an aisle, one careful step at a time, rearranging what is visible without any hint of malice. The best response is not speed, but method. Archaeologists stake out grids as tidy as graph paper, photograph shadows as if shadows were artifacts, and label bags with handwriting that will still be legible after the bag has outlived everyone who labeled it. In a discipline famous for dramatic finds, the Sahara excels at the small miracle, a bead that rolls into a poem, a hearth that admits to having once warmed millet, the neat negative of a post in hard-packed earth. Most days this is enough to make a person who loves order perfectly happy. And so the great question remains politely open. The eternal mystery underneath the dunes persists not because it is hiding anything mean-spirited, but because patience is its native language. A buried street goes on being a street. A stair continues to be a stair under a sand drift that behaves like a blanket. A tunnel holds its cool air and its shadow and waits. From space, more lines appear every year, as if the planet enjoys making little sketches when no one is looking. On the ground, a team will lift their hats to greet a crumbly wall and agree in unison that they are not in a hurry. A driver will pour tea 3 times, the sweet glass, the strong glass, the wise glass, and by the third, everyone will have remembered why they came. The camels will chew, the wind will proofread the camp. Somewhere nearby, the faint ring of a Nubian pyramid will throw a sharp shadow at 5 in the afternoon, and then fold it back up at 6, as tidy as a clerk closing a file. Night is generous here. It delivers a sky so full of crisp punctuation that even people who never cared about constellations feel themselves becoming copy editors. The Milky Way offers footnotes. Bats make small edits to the insects. If you lie very still, you can hear sand softening under the temperature change, as if every grain is releasing a tiny opinion. A guide lists the old wells by flavor iron, sweet, a little bitter, unless you greet it from the left, and accompanies each one with a story about a date palm that learned to count. An archaeologist, reading by headlamp, underlines a sentence about diatoms and then drifts off mid-underline, and the pen leaves a comma like a cat's whisker across the paper. This is how most research is actually performed, with commas that lengthen into naps. Morning is an unfussy phenomenon. Light appears with the courtesy of a knock. The wind checks the seams, nods, and goes about its day. The team walks out to the grid and measures the same square they measured yesterday and finds a new small thing anyway. A chip of painted plaster pretending to be the exact color of the surrounding earth until curiosity convinced it otherwise. The driver has coaxed the truck into being its better self. Someone announces, with the thrill of an accountant finding an old receipt, that a satellite image from last winter exactly matches a faint ridge underfoot. This is mildly exciting and immediately calms down into drawing a rectangle on a paper, map with a pencil sharpened to a diplomatic point. A line of footprints turns a corner and is gone by noon, erased by nothing dramatic, only the fact that time is alive and has preferences. So the lost civilization beneath the Sahara remains not lost in the sense of misplaced keys, but lost the way. A lullaby is lost when the child grows, and yet the tune keeps service in the back of your head. A city can sink and still be present. A road can go out of use and still lead. A river can fold up and still insist on pointing. The mystery is not a wall to knock down, but a room to sit in, with good air and honest quiet. If you'd like to stay here a little longer, the maps will keep. The satellites will continue their bright, quiet arguments with the ground. The Fagras will sigh. The small pyramids will continue to be certain of their angles. The dunes will practice their extremely slow curtsy toward the east. And if sleep reaches you before the next detail arrives, that is perfectly proper. The desert has a way of completing thoughts you meant to finish, and of filing them under a label it writes in the neatest hand. Here, for now, enough. You might not expect a sea of sand to have a memory, and yet the Sahara keeps receipts in the neatest handwriting, the kind of cursive only wind can do. If you're still awake by the time I start describing the angle at which a dune prefers to sit, feel free to subscribe in whatever way one subscribes to a whisper. Or don't, I'll never know. For now, we can tuck ourselves in beside a very slow campfire and listen to the rumors that drift along the edges of caravans like extra smoke. Rumors that cities can learn to nap for a few thousand years and wake. Without apology, the oldest whispers are the softest. Travelers speak of towns swallowed by sand with the patient efficiency of a librarian shelving books. There is the tale of a market where the bread was scored in a pattern that matched the local ripple marks, as if bakers took instruction from dunes. The bread is gone, naturally, but the ripple marks are punctual and still show up for work after. Every wind. There's the white city of Zuzura, often mentioned in a tone usually reserved for absent friends. It has gates that never squeaked, a pool that remained politely unclouded, and merchants who made change in coins that, inconveniently, no one could ever find again. Some versions include guardians with the polite unhelpfulness of cats. Other versions merely offer palm shade with exquisite accuracy. The stories are not what an archaeologist would call evidence. They are, however, exactly the kind of thing a tired brain finds persuasive at night. Between these rumors run lines so faint. You wouldn't see them unless you practice seeing ancient trade routes that move the way water used to, from well to well. A route could vanish overnight not because anything dramatic happened, but because something practical did. A well went brackish, or a toll developed a new syllable, and the next caravan took a parallel course half a valley away, leaving behind a perfectly serviceable road whose only crime was no longer being fashionable. Camels memorized the distances with their feet. People left graffiti on the good rocks, names that weather down into friendliness. Ships carved hundreds of miles from honest water, dates written larger than necessary by travelers keen on future readers. The wind did not erase these marks, so much as cushioned them, glazing the stone with a varnish so thin it seems like patience made visible. If legends float, evidence prefers altitude. From above, the desert shows the same self-restraint as a tidy notebook. Satellites watch the Sahara, the way owls watch a field, and the field confides more than you'd expect. Radar peeks beneath dunes and says, in a voice better suited to a museum, that an old riverbed runs there, broad as a conversation, braided into channels that have not been channels in a very long time. The Tamanrasat Paleoriver, excellent, name for something that still means river to the ground, once carried silt and gossip to the Atlantic. Elsewhere, high-resolution images show the faint, disciplined rectangles of ancient fields in places where the only crop now is light. There are desert kites, long V-shaped stone walls that quietly shepherded animals toward less ambiguous outcomes. There are dotted lines of maintenance shafts that betray underground channels, bogras, and canals that moved water horizontally because gravity enjoys being helpful. From orbit, the whole region seems to have been ruled by a geometry. Future with quiet pride. On the ground, more tangible shapes announce themselves. Pyramids appear, but not the pyramids people buy on postcards. In Nubia, around Meru and Nuri, steep-sided little pyramids rise like tidy doorstops, crowns of stone above chapels sunk below grade. Many are partly dressed in sand, as if the desert were attempting a tasteful renovation. Beyond these, in the Fezzan of Libya, lie tunnels of the Garamontes, an oasis people who solve the problem of thirst by doing paperwork with the bedrock. Their fagares run for kilometers, measured by buckets and repaired by dropping down shaft after shaft with the patience of an ant. If you climb into one in the early afternoon, you encounter air so cool and level-headed that the sun outside seems slightly overexcited. Trolls here make smaller noises. Brushes live their best lives. With images and tunnels in hand, theories settle in like cats on a warm wall. The kindest, most middle-of-the-shelf explanation says the Sahara has not always preferred beige. During the African humid period, roughly 10,000 to 5,000 years ago, The monsoon drifted north, and the desert briefly forgot itself. Lakes appeared and failed to be shy. People painted swimmers on cave walls because they were daily. Events, hippos had schedules. Fish were promoted to local delicacy. When the monsoon drifted back like a guest who remembered a prior engagement, the green retreated with manners. Shorelines froze as etched rings on hills. Dust rose to introduce itself to the Atlantic. Dunes rehearsed their angles until they remembered them perfectly. Communities adapted, then consolidated, then stepped away, leaving hearths with charcoal the size of careful commas. The evidence aligns in sediment cores like the layers of a cake baked by a geologist, one with a refined palate for dust. There are more industrious explanations, too. Some scholars point to people and their decisions grazing patterns, woodcutting, the severe friendliness of goats, accumulating across centuries to encourage scrub toward openness. Others watch the timing of volcanic eruptions and the polite wobble of Earth's orbit to argue for a climate that needed very little nudging. These conversations are hard to dramatize because their protagonists are pollen grains and diatoms. The mood in such debates is rarely urgent. A researcher will say, "It appears wetter here," and the room will agree, and a graph will nod, and everybody will go home satisfied that time has been respected. Where rumors go, myths follow, carrying luggage with unnecessarily handsome buckles. Atlantis always shows up, not because it belongs, but because a concentric ring is hard to resist. The Richet structure in Mauritania, those circular ridges, like a target pressed into the plateau, attracts comparisons the way a glass attracts. Condensation. From the air, it looks like a city diagram. On the ground, it looks like geology warming up for a recital. The circles are erosional features, layers of tough and less tough rock, sanded into rings by a patient climate. It is, in that sense, the ultimate anticlimax, which for our purpose is perfect. The story decelerates without stopping. Plato's island can keep its ocean. The Sahara has its own mythologies, Zerzura again, and caravans that set out after dawn and arrive at dusk convinced the horizon moved while they were busy. Myths are useful not as destinations but as lampposts. You tie a conversation to them and it doesn't drift. A different kind of memory sits on shelves in Timbuktu and Chineti and other manuscript towns. Folios written on paper that learn to endure dryness, bound in leather now the color of thoughtful earth. These are not tales of hidden cities, so much as proof that cities did not need to be hidden to exist. They contain legal opinions, arithmetic done in a tidy hand, medical recipes, astronomy by candlelight, letters, and lists so. Many lists of what arrived with the last caravan from Mulata and what it cost in salt. Salt, by the way, traveled as neatly cut slabs from Taudeni, stacked on camels that looked resigned but dignified, which is also how many of us approach our inboxes. A person who thinks of the Sahara only in terms of emptiness discovers here a library that believes quite the opposite. The wind tries to take a look and ends up adding a little marginal note. The question of why the world does not know the full truth, yet turns out to be boring in the most satisfying way. Archaeology in the Sahara is a discipline conducted against a backdrop of reasonable obstacles. Heat, which insists on being treated like a fact, distances that are allergic to haste, budgets that behave like seasonal rivers, and red tape that grows best in offices far from the field. A site must be mapped, protected, sometimes rebury to keep it safe from the affectionate. Enthusiasm of sunlight. A museum prefers an object to arrive in one piece. The object prefers to remain exactly where it has been napping. Compromise is an art form. Even satellite analysis requires ground truthing, a phrase that always sounds like you are telling the truth directly to the earth. Teams drive out to a pale squiggle on a screen and find a wall that has learned how to be modest. They pack samples in bags labeled in a handwriting that could survive an empire. They drink tea poured 3 times, bitter, strong, sweet, well. The tires cool into better versions of themselves. Another reason for the slow pace is the sand's professional courtesy. It keeps secrets without malice. A dune advances the way a librarian walks, unhurried but exact, relocating what is visible in a schedule no outsider needs to know. A trench cut on Tuesday can be politely refilled by Thursday unless you persuade the wind with barriers and optimism. Many of the best discoveries are small beads that fall into a palm. An ostrich eggshell water flask fragment, a hearth that admits to having warmed millet. The dramatic ruins, the kind you can fly a drone through, exist, but they do not queue for their close-ups. They prefer introductions by people with clipboards. The mystery at the heart of all, this is not a puzzle box, so much as a room with exceptionally good air. What exactly was built, and when? How the roots braided trade with scholarship, with household bread. How climate and choice braided change with continuity. These questions hover like a soft halo over the work. They are answerable in increments. Each season, some sentences lengthened by a clause. From orbit, new lines appear the way stars appear when you stop trying and just look. On the ground, a wall segment joins another wall segment, and a corner decides to be a corner. The map grows. It does not apologize for doing so slowly. If you feel sleepy, that is an appropriate response to several kinds of progress, including this one. When night arrives in the desert, it does not so much fall as unfurl. The air turns clear the way a bell sounds. The sky arranges itself into paragraphs of light. People who have never thought of the Milky Way as anything but a picture find themselves proofreading it. Somewhere a fox decides the camp is interesting and leaves a footnote. A field notebook receives a sentence about diatoms and then a long, elegant line where the researcher drifted off mid-thought, which will later be interpreted as either handwriting or excellent nap. If you lie on your back, the sand gives. Slightly like a very polite mattress, the wind softens its consonants. It becomes unreasonably easy to believe a city is sleeping directly below your shoulder blades. Morning is not dramatic. It rehearses the same entrance every day and deserves points for consistency. The team returns to the grid of strings that make the earth look like it's being prepared for embroidery. A satellite printout gets held next to the horizon. Someone says, "There," and everyone else nods because the rectangle is faint and must be encouraged. The trowel does what a trowel does best, which is to make small decisions. A colleague remarks that the stratigraphy is well behaved, a compliment any layer would be proud to receive. A bead turns up that is the exact color of the surrounding soil, but slightly shinier, as if it had been practicing all night. Nobody cheers. They write, they bag, they shade their necks. Another square is finished and becomes an invitation to think in the past tense. As for the legends of cities swallowed by sand, they keep their tone. A place can disappear without leaving. In a huff. It can simply agree with the climate. Walls become suggestions. Doorways become the memory of doorways. Wells remember water with perfect clarity, even when they are dry. You walk across a plain, and the solace of your feet transmit the news that someone respected cleverness here. This is enough. The lostness is a kind of courtesy. It spares the city the indignity of spectacle. If you ask the dunes to show you everything at once, they would refuse on principle. Sometimes, while the camp stove mutters and someone counts sample bags in a voice just above a whisper, talk returns to the White City. It would be convenient to find it, if only to thank it for its service to bedtime. Yet a small reasonable part of the mind, the part that enjoys correctly folded maps and the smell of pencil shavings, suspects Zazura is doing its job better by not appearing. A myth that remains just beyond the next ridge teaches patience. It can be referenced by children, mentioned by scholars, footnoted by camels. It keeps curiosity in fighting trim without forcing anybody to fight. And so the lost civilization beneath the Sahara remains evenly lit by questions. The lines from orbit, the little pyramids absorbing afternoon, the underground corridors, the manuscripts that talk about salt with the same gravity as long, the half-vanished roads that still know how far a day should be together, they hum the same note, present, present, present. The full truth is not missing, it is pacing itself. If sleep arrives while we are still discussing the angle of repose of safe dunes, or why desert varnish takes centuries to produce a gloss you can mistake. For thought, that is all right. The desert is excellent at finishing a sentence for you. It knows how to place a period on a line of footprints, and when the time is right, how to write another line a little farther on. Nothing here is in a hurry except the sun at noon, and even it pretends to slow down when the tea is poured for the third time, sweet enough to convince the day to sit. You might not expect a desert to keep secrets as tidily as a filing cabinet, but the Sahara does, and it labels the drawers with wind. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe to these hushed footnotes of history, perhaps, by thinking kindly at the pause button, or don't, I'll never know. Either way, the night is long enough to listen to the rumors that travel at the speed of a camel's yawn, rumors that cities once breathed here and learned with impressive patience how to nap beneath the sand. The whispers arrive the way dawn does in a tent, not as a shout, but as a brightness that politely insists. A guide points his stick at a line of dunes and tells you there was once a market in that undulation, with a baker who scored loaves to match the ripple marks, so no piece of bread ever looked lost. Another voice says there is a white city called Zerzura where the gates never squeaked, which is exactly the kind of detail people remember when everything else becomes a suggestion. Caravan songs mention wells that tasted of coins and dates, and a caravanserai whose doorway aligned with a particular star, which, if true, indicates that the architect kept unusual office hours. None of this is compulsory to believe. It is, however, soothing to imagine a street that simply grew tired of being a street and took a long, sandy breath. Trade routes helped carry the stories, and then, almost absent-mindedly, they misplaced themselves. The lines across the desert moved from well to well like careful handwriting, and they could vanish overnight without drama. Perhaps a toll gained an extra syllable. Perhaps a watchful hill lost its shadow to a new dune. The caravan chose a parallel path a few valleys over, and the old path retired into anonymity, attended by patient lizards and an occasional bead that resisted the memo. There were distances measured by steps and verses, and navigators who could tell you how far until the next palm by the taste of the wind. Someone once drew a map on a goat skin, then rolled it so tightly the creases lasted longer than the road it described. In the morning, the creases were the better directions, if rumors. Float. Evidence prefers altitude. Satellites began to look down at the Sahara with the mild stare of owls, and the sand, used to being underestimated, responded by showing its geometry. Radar slipped beneath dunes and sketched the braided ghost of the Tamanrasset River, a pale, ribbon wide as a sigh, headed for the Atlantic in another lifetime. High-resolution images sent back the kind of rectangles that only humans make when they intend something. Grids of ancient fields in places where the only crop now is sunlight. You can see desert kites from orbit, long V-shaped stone fences. That invited animals to make regrettable decisions. Shorelines of ancient lakes make a chat like to be called by its full name draw rings on the landscape like a thoughtful teacup. Even the dunes confess to an angle of repose so consistent it feels like a rule written by a very calm teacher. Closer in, evidence arrives with the weight of a trowel and the rhythm of brushing. There are pyramids in Nubia, small and steep, like a skyline written in italics. They sit partly dressed in sand as if the desert is attempting peaceful interior design. There are underground channels in the Libyan Fizan, fogaras that carried water with the steady good manners of gravity. Their maintenance shafts dot the surface like a list of reminders. If you stand at one and listen, the air that rises has the kind of cool that makes noon reconsider itself. In Western Egypt, galleries and tombs switch between rock and patient. Plaster and inscriptions pretend to be casual. A bead falls into a palm with the soft sound of history deciding to be specific. Elsewhere, rock art shows swimmers and cattle, suggesting that the desert once forgot it was a desert and tried on the idea of lakes with startling success. The tools that reveal these things enjoy technical terms that sound like lullabies. Is optical luminescence dating, which persuades quartz grains to admit when they last saw honest lighta. Reliable confessor if given a proper laboratory and a quiet afternoon. There are declassified satellite photographs from the 1960s that behave like time capsules with excellent posture. Synthetic aperture radar has a name that sounds busier than it feels. Its images are all patience and stripes. You begin to realize that the Sahara is covered in invisible lines waiting for a calm instrument and a person with a pencil. The pencil matters. Every map of a new feature begins as a hesitant sketch that slowly believes itself. Theories like tents need gentle pulls. In agreeable weather, one of the kinder explanations says that the Sahara has practiced several careers. During the African humid period, the monsoon drifted north and the region staged a convincing impression of savanna. Lakes formed and behaved beautifully. Hippos set up schedules. People followed the water and painted what they saw, swimmers. Bent at the waist, cattle with the correct number of legs, and boats that seemed to travel across stone with dignified silence. When the monsoon wandered south against Earth's orbit, which enjoys long-term projects, adjusted the light, the grass retired. Dust made itself important. Dunes rehearsed being dunes until they were flawless at 34 degrees. People adapted, packed, and adopted again. The shoreline of each vanished lake left a ring, like a nap line on the planet's cheek. Other explanations are industrious and enjoy a committee. Goats arrive and trim the vegetation with a gardener's ambition. Firewood becomes lighter in the arms and rarer in the landscape. Wind steps in to make introductions between grains that ought never to have met. Over centuries, a human presence that is modest at any one moment adds up to a chorus, and the chorus sings in the key of openness. You hold a pollen core up too. The light and the layers behave like a very thin cake. Grass, shrub, dust, dust, dust. None of it argues. It nods back at you. If drama exists here, it is on the scale of a calendar, and the calendar is sleepy. Myths have their own timetables and prefer handsome luggage. Atlantis arrives the way a celebrity turns up at a quiet cafe, noticed mostly by people who were already looking. The rigid structure, with its concentric ridges in Mauritania, obliges by resembling a target left on a windowsill. From an airplane, it can almost be a diagram. On the ground, it is geology clearing its throat. Layers of rock, some proud, some shy, eroded into rings by a wind that understands circles. The comparison is tempting, but the rocks fail to mention a lost sea empire and politely remind you that Plato was having a thought experiment. Meanwhile, Zerzura continues to be the friend who might show up to dinner or might not, which is part of the charm. Uber appears in conversations like a distant cousin who insists they are famous somewhere else. Myths are not evidence. They are invitations that often lead to evidence wearing different shoes. Why doesn't the world know the full truth already? Partly because the Sahara is busy being large. It prefers scale as a conversation starter. Many of the most promising sites are several reasonable days from anywhere, on roads that change their minds after sandstorms. Funding, like rain, arrives seasonally and with opinions. Permits bloom in offices far from the dig and require delicate care. A trench that looks promising on Tuesday can be politely refilled by Thursday, unless you persuade the wind with fences. And optimism. Field notes acquire corners of dust that turn pages slower, which suits the pace. A core sample must be threaded through customs with labels that do not smudge, because bureaucracy respects handwriting. Another reason is that the sand is a professional at discretion. It covers without condemnation. A wall becomes a hung. A city becomes a texture underfoot that tells the solace of your shoes that somebody here once respected cleverness. Archaeology in such a place asks for a steady heart rate. You spend a morning with square strings and pegs, turning the earth into graph. Paper. You brush until a line of stones begins to feel intentional. Then you brush some more. The discovery is not a shout, but a sentence that lengthens politely. If a fragment of ostrich eggshell water flask appears, it does so with the grace of something that would rather not cause a fuss. And yet the quiet is generous. Manuscripts sleep in Timbuktu and Chinguetti, in rooms that learn the trick of coolness. Legal opinions, star charts, recipes for ink, lists of what came in with the last caravan from Wallata, all as proud of their margins as their main text. Salt traveled as slabs from Taudeni, stacked on camels that accepted their job descriptions. A slab might be used as currency, which made paying for things satisfyingly heavy. Gold moved along with it, and cloth, and the kind of news that lives well in a letter. The library of the desert is bound in leather and dust, which feels appropriate, as if the region wrapped its thoughts the same way it wrapped its mornings. The eternal part of the mystery is not that it refuses to be solved. It is that it prefers to be solved slowly. Satellites add new lines on their next pass. Ground teams add new corners to their maps and gently erase some earlier confidence. A bead's place in a layer tells a story that makes a climate graph. Tilt its head. You drink tea poured 3 times bitter, strong, sweet, and the day cooperates. A fox leaves annotations around the camp at night in the form of careful footprints, which a field school student records with more enthusiasm than necessary. The dunes hum, which is not romanticism. It is physics with good acoustics. At night, the wind edits the camp down to essentials. The sky discovers it has room for every star it has ever owned, and the Milky Way behaves like a well-kept ledger. If you lie very still, the ground persuades you that a city could be sleeping below you, a plan of streets that would be happy to meet you, but not tonight. You close your eyes and feel the tiniest shift as a grain settles against its neighbor. A transaction recorded without ink. Somewhere, a wall decides it will continue being a wall for 1 more year. Somewhere else, a well remembers the taste of water with irritating accuracy. Morning adopts its usual competence. The grid lines tauten, the pencil sharpens. Someone describes the stratigraphy as well-behaved, which is the highest compliment field notes can offer. A satellite printout, creased exactly where it always creases, is compared against the horizon, which has no creases at all and looks faintly smug. There is a rectangle no one noticed yesterday. You could miss it today if you blinked. The team does not blink. The trowel resumes its patient arguments with sediment. A small figurine emerges with a face that seems to understand meetings. Nobody. Cheers. They write down the coordinates as if the coordinates were quietly famous. If this episode has a conclusion, it is the kind that drifts rather than lands. The Sahara is full of pages turned by wind, and some of them have writing that is not yet visible. The lost civilization beneath the sand is both plural and present. Settlements that waked and slept, channels that remembered the direction of flow, fields that held the shape of care long after the grain retired. The myths keep good company. With the maps, the evidence travels in tubes and envelopes labeled in ink that dries too quickly in the sun. The world does not know the full truth because the full truth is taking its time, and because taking one's time is an underrated art form. If you're still awake, you may have noticed that deserts are excellent at bedtime. They repeat themselves without being repetitive. They care about angles and edges in a way that encourage the brain to set down its heavy bag. A dune's favorite number is the same today as it was yesterday. A satellite passes overhead at the appointed second with the demeanor of a punctual librarian. A camel kneels with a sound that could be a sigh or a joke. Someone pours the last of the tea and watches the sugar dissolve at the exact rate good news should travel. Somewhere out there, a city has decided to remain considerate and sleep a little longer under a blanket without corners while we do the same. You might not expect a desert to keep secrets as neatly as a library, but the Sahara files its mysteries by wind and keeps the index under a dune. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to follow along for more bedtime footnotes. No hurry, no pressure, certainly no quizzes in the morning. Tonight we listen to the sort of quiet Bassam prefers, where a city can be reduced to a rumor you can walk across, and a story becomes truer each time it's retold in the shade of a date palm. Guides point at lines on the horizon the way archivists point at shelves. There, they say, a gate once stood. There, a market. There, a fountain that coughed politely at noon. In some versions, the city was called Zerzura. In others, it had no name because names are heavy and caravans already had enough to carry. People speak of whitewashed walls that reflected the sun so well you could borrow light from them, and of doors that never creaked because the hinges were oiled with something secret and probably sticky. The details are so pleasantly unnecessary. You begin to trust them. Someone remembers a clerk who kept accounts with a reed pen that squeaked like a patient cricket. Someone else remembers a potter who etched waves along the rims of bowls, even when the nearest water was a metaphor. The legends agree on one thing only. The sand arrived with the manners of a courteous guest, sat down, and never left. It is helpful to imagine the desert not as an ocean, but as a very calm bureaucracy. It issues travel permits in the form of wells and grants exemptions for shade. For centuries, trade routes stitched the Sahara to itself, long threads drawn from oasis to oasis, wearing grooves into the world that could be followed at night by the taste of the wind. A caravan came for gold or salt, or the kind of news that travels better wrapped in cloth. The lines were steady until they weren't. One season a well failed. 1 year a toll gained an extra syllable. One afternoon a dune decided to introduce itself to a valley and stayed for generations. A road can vanish overnight when everyone agrees politely to use a different one. The old way doesn't close. It is simply not consulted. Somewhere the crease goatskin map is still correct, but the creases have outlived the path, and the camel who knew the route by heart now knows something else, like where the good tamarisk grows. Every lost road leaves behind a small archaeology of pocket litter and amber bead, a shard of blue glass that waits for a barefoot or a curious lark. Evidence, when it finally arrives, prefers altitude. Satellites gaze down with the unblinking patience of owls, and in their images the sand loses a little of its shyness. Radar, which does not mind darkness or dust, sketches the buried shapes of things that once stayed up late. You can see the ghost of an old river, the Tamanrasset, wide as a yawn, braided as a rug, slanting toward the Atlantic from a time when the Sahara rehearsed being green and got good at it. You can make out desert kites, those long stone funnels that persuaded wild herds to concentrate the way tea persuades thoughts to concentrate. Some images show the crisp geometry of agriculture, where there is now only the geometry of light. Rectangular fields drawn by hands that liked straight edges more than they liked rain. The shorelines of giant paleo lakes loop the landscape like forgotten bangles. Megachag preferred elaborate jewelry. Even dunes confessed their favorite number, the angle of repose repeating it across horizons, as if a very relaxed mathematician were in charge. On the ground, the clues are more tactile and tend to arrive attached to dust. There are pyramids in Nubia, smaller and steeper than their Egyptian cousins, leaning into the sky as if whispering to it. There are fagras under parts of Libya, underground water channels that practice the art of slow with professional pride. There are maintenance shafts dotting the surface like the punctuation of patience. If you lean over one on a hot day, the rising air is cool enough to change your opinion of the afternoon. Rock art spreads swimmers and cattle across stone walls, straightforwardly reporting that there was once enough water for swimming and enough grass to make cattle conversational. In a few places, tunnels and chambers hint at storage or sanctuary. Where the roof remains, the echoes have good manners. A bead turns up in a trowel scoop with a mild expression of something that refused to leave a party early. An inscription remembers someone's name in letters that think they will be read again, soon, and seem charmed to find out they were right. Dating these whispers is its own gentle science. Quartz grains keep a kind of bedtime diary. Optical luminescence dating coaxes them very politely to tell us when they last saw the sun. Cores taken from ancient lake beds build a layer cake of pollen that reads like climate's grocery list graph. Shrub, dust again. Old satellite photographs, declassified with the crispness of a well-folded letter, show tracks in walls that later dunes tried to erase and failed to quite forget. Every instrument has a calm voice. Synthetic aperture. Radar hums and stripes. Multispectral imagery, size, and colors no eye owns. The data arrive as grids, and the grids are traced by pencils that sharpen to a tidy point, because some parts of discovery are proudly analog. None of it makes a loud claim. All of it nods in the same direction, the way tents faced together before. A waned that means business, but not rudeness. Theories set up their shade next. The simplest is a story about rain that moved. The African humid period poured the monsoon further north. The desert tried on lakes and found they fit. People settled where the light took its afternoon nap on the water, and they scratched calendars into stone with the energy of optimistic farmers. Then the orbit of the planet adjusted its long, slow geometry, the sort of change you feel only if you own a very patient sundial, and the rains retreated. Grass withdrew like a polite guest, who had stayed just long enough. The dunes rehearsed their part, each grain taking its place at just the angle you learned about in school, and then forgot until a dune reminded you, in stereo. Communities followed the water's retreat, became caravans, and then fragments of caravans. The Sahara did not become empty. It simply changed the terms of conversation. Other explanations appreciate committees. Goats trim shrubs the way accountants trim budgets. Firewood walks away one armful at a time, which is almost charming until you add a few centuries. Wayne sees the new openness and obliges by moving the smallest pieces somewhere else again and again until the somewhere else becomes a dune with opinions. A drought arrives, stays longer than it meant to, and is promoted to climate. In this towing, people do not ruin the landscape. They talk to it so often in so many small, practical ways that the conversation changes its accent. A core sample reads like minutes taken from a very long meeting. A note here for burning, a note there for grazing, a pause for dust storms, adjourned until the next millennium. No single motion carried the day. The day simply kept happening. When the subject turns to myths, the desert smiles and says nothing. Atlantis arrives as usual with excellent luggage. People point toward the rigid structure in Mauritania, a handsome series of concentric ridges that from the air could be mistaken for an architectural diagram or a giant's forgotten saucer. On the ground is geology practicing circles, layers. of rock warped, lifted, weathered, and then polished by time until their rings sat like a target on the landscape. It resembles many things. It documents a lost empire only in the way a seashell documents the ocean, which is to say, metaphorically. Zerzura continues to be a favorite story for exactly the same reason a lullaby is a favorite song. Not because it proves anything, but because it arrives on time. Uber wanders in like a cousin from the Arabian sands who heard there was tea. Myths are not guilty. They are simply enthusiastic. They send you toward places where the ground has clearly been. Thinking. The world, for all its instruments, still doesn't know the full truth, and the reasons are uppercase ordinary. The Sahara is wide in the confident way of a sky. Reaching a promising rectangle on a satellite map can require a week of respectable improvisation plus a tire repair that becomes a parable. Funding behaves like rainfall seasonal, generous in the right year, bashful in the wrong one. Permits bloom in offices far from the dig and smell faintly of photocopier. A sandstorm can rearrange your plans and your tent with equal competence. The best season for fieldwork is also the best season for being at home. And the artifacts themselves prefer discretion. A wall's foundation may choose to be a suggestion, and a shard may choose to be smaller than the box you prepared for it. Archaeology here is not a matter of shouts. It is a matter of listening for the sound a trowel makes when it taps something that disapproves of being called rock. There is also the slow choreography of care. A find must be measured, drawn, photographed, bagged, labeled in ink that dries too quickly, and entered in a notebook whose pages capture a small museum of dust. The coordinates go down with extra digits because the GPS has opinions. The sample leaves the field in a convoy of envelopes and arrives in a laboratory that looks exactly as you hope. Quiet machines. Serious tea, a calendar that features either cats or ruins. Analyses take their time out of respect for being correct. An unexpected result prompts a second test, which politely requests a third. Meanwhile, the desert continues its own routines. Camels carry slabs of salt from Taudeni as if currency should always clink, and in the libraries of Timbuktu and Chingeti, manuscripts brave calmly on their wooden shelves, dark with the modest glamour of ink and leather. On some pages you can see notes about trade gold tallies, cloth tallies, gossip disguised as logistics, and you realize the desert kept its ledger even when nobody remembered the columns existed. The silence of the Sahara is not empty. It is, full in a way that lulls. At night, under a sky that has memorized every star, the wind travels through the guy lines with a tune you could hum if you owned enough years. The dunes hum too, when conditions are correct grains cascading in chorus, a bass note born from friction and patience. A fox leaves annotations around the camp, and a student copies them into the margins of a notebook because every field school has one student who loves margins. Somewhere not far, a line of stones is deciding whether it is a fence, a wall, or a suggestion. The decision can take a century. The eternal mystery is not being coy. It is being thorough. The desert is a long book printed in very fine type, and we are still on the early pages, reading aloud so we don't fall asleep, which is, of course, exactly the plan. By morning, the work resumes with the healthy redundancy of ritual. Strings are stretched into squares that give the land graph paper. The first trowel trotter says soil, the second says soil, the third says perhaps. A rectangle appears that wasn't there yesterday, or was there and simply refused to be obvious. Someone asks for the brush. Everyone has the brush. A bead rolls into a palm as if it has been practicing. A line of darker sediment crosses a lighter layer and announces with polite firmness that time passed here and much paperwork. The satellite printout gets another circle drawn in pencil, The pencil is always too sharp at first, then perfect, then suddenly shy, and the circle sits beside. 10 others like a necklace diagrammed by hesitation. None of this is dramatic. All of it is quietly persuasive. If you're still with me, still drifting but curious, you can think of the Sahara as a careful archivist of water, where it went, where it lingered, where people followed it and painted. Swimmers on stone because that day there were swimmers. The lost civilization under the sand may not be a single capital with a correct street map. It is more likely a pattern of settlements, wells, gardens, storehouses, workshops, and rest stops and infrastructure of patience knitted across centuries by people who understood what shade is worth. The pyramids, the tunnels, the kites, the fields, the manuscripts, the trade routes that retired with dignity. Together, they describe a landscape that took human time seriously and then tucked it away. Like a letter placed carefully in a book for safekeeping, we will learn more. Another satellite will pass at a more flattering angle. Another season will open a trench exactly where a line on the screen suggested. And there will be a foundation stone that still believes in corners. A new method will ask a grain of sand a slightly better question about the last time it saw the sun, and the grain will answer with its usual candor. The stories will become less rumor and more sentence, but not all at once. The desert seems to prefer a bedtime pace, a word every few breaths, details added in the same unhurried way a date palm adds rings you cannot see, so you can rest now. The dunes will keep your place in the book. The wind will close the covers. Gently, and somewhere below the sand, a city will continue its long, comfortable nap, certain that when it wakes, we will be speaking softly and taking notes in pencil. You might not expect a desert to keep receipts, but the Sahara is an excellent bookkeeper. It files entire cities under miscellaneous and lets the wind handle the indexing. If you're still awake a few minutes from now, feel free to follow along or subscribe to this quiet habit of listening to sand, no pressure at all, and please don't sit up. The legends begin as they always do, with someone pointing toward a line of heat in the distance and insisting there used to be a gate. There, and a baker who sold sesame bread stamped with a tiny sun, and a well whose rope creaked like a polite violin. A city called Zazura appears in whispers like a shy heron at dusk. White walls, cold water, a door with a key shaped like an egg. In other stories, the city has no name because the name was written on palm paper, and palm paper does not argue with weather. One caravan master swore he felt cobbles beneath his camel's feet where the map offered nothing but etiquette and emptiness. Another claimed to have seen windows blinking under the surface like eyes refusing to wake. The details are so tenderly unimportant that they become persuasive. A perfumer bottled the scent of dates and shade. A scribe kept accounts on a reed, tablet, and complained, in the oldest known handwriting for Uha, that the sand filled his ink. In the version told by drivers on the long tracks south of Gadames, a watchmaker once lived there who never sold a watch because the day was so bright nobody asked for time. The routes to these places were once as reliable as lullabies. Oases were beads strung loosely on lines of salt and rumor. From Saiwa to Kowur to Bilma to Agadas, caravans moved in patient chord progressions, the bells on the camels working out a steady rhythm like a metronome with opinions. Traders followed stars they gave nicknames to so they could remember them more fondly. The goat in the jar and the one that doesn't mind clouds. When a well soured, a path slipped an inch. When a dune walked a mile, the road walked with it. Occasionally, the desert performed a quick administrative act and sanded over a pass. And the next morning, the old itinerary was a charming historical document that should probably have been archived last year. A man from Tuat once drew anew. map on a saddle flap because parchment was too confident for the situation, another carved directions into the handle of his staff, and then lost the staff to a friendly thief who only wanted a walking stick with character. The trade still went on, like breathing in a room where someone has turned down the lights. Spices, beads, ostrich feathers, slabs of salt stacked like books with uninteresting titles, and the familiar cargo no ledger remembers to count baby gossip, new jokes. A recipe for porridge that never quite tastes the same moved along routes. That existed because everyone said they did, which is how roads generally work. Eventually, the desert tired of being accused of silence and started sending memos from space. Satellites, which never blink and don't care for romance, looked down and began to see. In radar images, a buried river, the Tamanrasset, flows across the map like a long sigh, wider than a highway of clouds, proving that what is now unyielding beige was once a lawn so confident it kept hippos. Elsewhere, faint lines appear, the geometry of agriculture where there should be only the geometry of wind. Rectangles made by hands who loved right angles more than rainfall. Long stone funnels, desert kites, stretched toward points where hunters waited for herds to willingly become history. Under certain wavelengths, the shorelines of Paleolakes loop the land in lazy ovals. Old Lake Megachad wears a bracelet that still fits. You can even see dunes frozen mid-gesture, their slip faces telling the exact angle of repose you learned in school and filed under rarely useful, which now feels unreasonably relevant. The desert, it turns out, is photogenic when asked. Politely, it isn't hiding. It is simply composed, on the ground. The evidence behaves like the shy cousin at a family dinner, present, helpful, not imposing. In Nubia, pyramids stand narrower and steeper than the famous ones up north, like pencils sharpened just a bit too enthusiastically. They throw precise shadows at noon and catch moonlight with the discipline of good mirrors. In Libya, Fagrestos. Underground water channels run like lowercase letters beneath the soil, a steady script written in limestone and patience. The maintenance shafts punctuate the surface every few paces, commas in a sentence too long to fit on one page. If you lean over a shaft, the air that rises introduces itself as evening, even at noon. Rock art into silly measure puts swimmers and cattle where now only wind practices swimming. The figures look relaxed as if they had all day, which they did. In a few wadis, tunnels and chambers survive under piles of stone, the remains of granaries or retreats dug for the same reason basements exist. Life is easier with somewhere to put things. A bead rolls into a trowel with the demeanor of an old coin that refuses to feel surprised. A potsherd offers its rim with a wry smile, as if to say it still knows how much water it held. Stone alignments stretch along ridges, possible fences, possible processions, possible messages to the sky that the sky reads at its own speed. The dating of these clues is almost recreational in its calmness. Quartz grains keep a private calendar. Optically stimulated luminescence, which would be a good name for a candle store, persuades them to whisper when they were last kissed by sunlight. Lake cores pull up layered stories of pollen grass, then shrubs, then the reliable return of dust, like the third act of a play that never gets canceled. Holds by photographs, unclassified with illegible bachelor charm, show walls and tracks, half erased by later sands. When researchers trace them onto transparent sheets, the lines pile up like answers to a question no one remembers asking. Nothing raises its voice, and still the picture assembles. There used to be a garden here, the soil says, not helpfully specifying where here has wandered in the last 4,000 years. Then the theories unpack their tents and get comfortable. The easiest one tells of rain that moved north and then politely left. During the African humid period, monsoons climbed up the map and threw a party. Lakes swelled. Grasses rehearsed. Swagger. People built villages where shade fell just right and water sang in small, continuous sentences. They carved calendars into rock and watched a horizon that kept promises. Slowly, almost theatrically slowly, Earth's orbit adjusted its long numbers. The monsoon retreated like a guest who has remembered an appointment. The lakes rehearsed. Being memories, the grass apologized and sat down. People folded their houses, wore them as caravans, and went looking for the river that had chosen to be elsewhere. The process was not a catastrophe so much as an unhurried vote. Dune by dune, season by season, the landscape agreed to be different. The old empire, if that is not too grand a word for a necklace of towns, did not fall. It exhaled, and the wind finished the sentence. Another set of explanations prefers the small habits. Goats edit vegetation with an enthusiasm that would earn them a desk in any bureaucracy. Firewood walks away one branch at a time until a hill forgets it once wore a hat. Water tables lower themselves as if in deference to dignity. Wind notices the new openness and slides grains from here to near here, again and again, until near here is far away. A few lean years group together and declare themselves climate. In this telling, people did not ruin the Sahara. They collaborated. With it accidentally, the way committees collaborate on time, every individual decision reasonable, the result impressively permanent. Core samples record this as a series of polite entries: charcoal, less grass, more dust, a long nap, and then there are the myths, which arrive with excellent manners and embroidered cloakrims. Atlantis makes its usual cameo, gesturing toward the rigid structure in Mauritania. An arrangement of concentric rings so photogenic from the air that it looks like architecture sighing. On the ground is geology demonstrating circles, uplift, erosion, minerals arranging themselves into rings because time had time. Some argue the resemblance is meaningful. The rocks reply in their most geologic tone, which sounds like long laughter. Other stories return to Zerzura, the white city with almond trees and a gate that opens only to the kind of person legends approve of. It is the very best kind of bedtime story, non-committal, portable, uninterested in maps. The point is not to find it so much as to have something delightful to point toward. When the sky is too large to talk to directly, why the world still doesn't know the full truth is surprisingly practical. The Sahara is wider than patience and deeper than schedules. A promising square on a satellite image can set a week's drive away through country that changes mood and texture hourly. Permissions require stamps that live in buildings blessed, with fans but not with speed. Funding is seasonal like rain, and sometimes the season is elsewhere. A sandstorm publicizes your field camp to the horizon and then rearranges it into an exhibition on impermanence. Vehicles acquire new noises that become inside jokes. Ah, that's Tuesday. And tires learn to impersonate brief tragedies. Equipment behaves like honorable pets, faithful, dusty, occasionally sulking. Even when a trench opens exactly where the data suggested, the earth prefers to reveal itself as a sequence of almosts, a wall that thinks it is a suggestion, a hearth that refuses to be drawn unless the charcoal is shaded correctly. Archaeology here is a ceremony of patience measure, sketch, bag, label, sigh, drink water. Measure again because the shadow moved, transporting meaning from the field to the page, is its own gentle expedition. Samples travel wrapped like delicate snacks. Notebooks grow the kind of dust that eventually deserves a name. Back in the lab, machines hum as if completing short hymns. Radiocarbon dates appear with the triumphant modesty of extra digits. A grain of sand confesses its last sunbath in a curve that looks like a sleepy hill. Pollen grains peer back from the microscope, wearing dinosaur helmets the size of seconds. Every result invites a second result, which politely demands a third, and suddenly a year has gone by without apologizing. Meanwhile, the desert continues to keep appointments without telling anyone. Camels still carry salt from Taudeni like shelves on legs. Market day in Agada still arranges its colors like a well-meaning mosaic. In the manuscript libraries of Timbuktu and Chineti, ink breathes through leather. Margins contain the jokes, as margins reliably do. A merchant drawing a tiny boat and labeling it, "A friend I will never need." The world is not withholding answers, it is busy living. The mystery that waits to be unearthed is not a single capital with a ceremonial boulevard. It is a pattern you only see by standing very still. Picture gardens coaxed from ground that only listens in the cool of morning. Picture storehouses, low and practical, windows placed where the wind goes by without conversation. Picture workshops that smell like wet clay and ash, tools hung in the order of use rather than the order of pride. Picture cisterns lined with lime, lidded like deep drums. Picture a calendar scratched into a lintel, suns counted with the kind of accuracy that requires long boredom. Now stretch these pictures across centuries, tie them together with a string of wells, season them with trade, and give them a handwriting the wind respects. That more than a lost metropolis is what the desert likely holds, the infrastructure of patience, weatherproofed by habit, then tenderly folded by dunes. To unroll it, you must move slowly enough for time to recognize you. If you're still listening, let the rest of the evidence arrive as softly as a kettle reaching almost boil. On a ridge near Kufra, lines of stones make a very modest right angle. A trowel taps something that answers jar in a voice as light as a grain. In a trench by a dried lake, a layer of dark soil containing fish bones apologizes for being so far from water. A bead of blue glass, confident in its color, refuses to admit it came from anywhere less glamorous than the coast. Someone draws a plan in pencil that insists on being too sharp at first, then perfect, then suddenly blunt like a small biography. The camp radio reports a forecast of more sky. The night arranges Scorpius and Cygnus in an argument about tea into constellations. Sleep turns the canvas roof into a page and writes slow wind across it. In the morning, the squares of string are still there. Patient as graph paper dot, by now the first section of our wandering has settled, and another begins without needing to be named. We move from the whispers to the measured murmurs, those patterns, from above and the stones below that agree without drama. For every rectangle that appears on the screen, there is a day of aligning coordinates. A moment when a GPS receiver loses confidence and then regains it with a beep that sounds like gratitude. For every kite, there is a discussion about the ethics of hunting and the physics of guiding panic gently. For every Paleolithic shoreline you can trace with your finger, there is a sudden wish for a long, cool swim in the sort of water that never apologizes for being wet. Micro hooks exist even here, tucked into the folds. A Roman coin far from home sleeping beside a bead carved in a workshop that smelled of palm wine. A pottery rim that fits a modern kitchen bowl as if time enjoys practical jokes. A hearth where someone burned grass that released the scent of a rainy year and made the trench crew unnecessarily sentimental. When speculation returns, and it will, wearing the hat it keeps for such occasions, we let it sit in the shade and speak. Maybe an early empire stood where now a dune practices posture. Maybe its influence was measured not in monuments, but in calendars that worked, markets that met on Thursdays, and a kind of bread that taught manners. Climate changed as it does. People adapted as they do. The empire did not vanish. It learned to walk. If someone longs for Atlantis, we hand them a seat and a biscuit. We point at the rechat rings and say the rocks look brave today. We agree that stories serve a purpose like shade, not strictly necessary, but certainly preferable. We remember That the job of a myth is to invite curiosity to keep its sandals on, not to run ahead and claim the prize. The final quiet, we have been drifting toward it already, belongs to the desert itself. Day heat rises and tilts the way a full glass, trembles in the hand. At dusk, wind threads the guy lines and tunes them to a note that might be C or might be patience. Dunes boom when conditions approve, a bass note from sand grains deciding to move together. A pale fox collects footnotes around the camp and leaves them in careful trails. The best sentence of the day is not spoken. It is drawn in footprints, and then unwritten by the night. Why don't we know the full truth? Because truth, like water here, prefers to sit deep and clear, not rush to the surface and make headlines. Because distances are actual distances, and calendars must negotiate with seasons, and resources, both human and otherwise, arrive by caravan time, not courier. Because some answers live in languages still being learned by instruments and hands. So the eternal mystery is less a locked room than a quiet library with many chairs. New satellites will pass, kinder angles will be tried, and a rectangle of stone will shrug off a little sand. Another season will produce another small map, which will explain one thing and convert 3 others into questions containing measurements. Someone will test a grain that tells a different decade than expected, and this will not be disappointing. It will simply be accurate at a scale that allows for naps. The desert will continue filing and refiling. Camels will continue to overrule. Urgency. Somewhere under the sand, a threshold will bide its time. The stone still polished by feet we cannot count, waiting for the day a trowel's tap sounds like yes. Until then, the dunes will keep your place in the book. The wind will lower the lamp, and the Sahara will hum the softest possible song about cities that learned how to sleep and never quite forgot how to wake.